Welcome back for our last talk of the morning. This has been a really powerful set of panels and talks so far. So I'm happy to introduce our second plenary speaker, Vinson Cunningham. Vinson joined The New Yorker as a staff writer in 2016. Since 2018, he has served as a critic for the magazine, writing about theater, television, and more. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2024 and 2025, and was awarded the George Jean Nathan Award for Dramatic Criticism for 2021 to 2022. And in 2020, he was a finalist for a National Magazine Award for profile writing. He teaches at the Yale School of Art and Columbia University School of the Arts, and is a co-host of Critics at Large, The New Yorker's weekly podcast about culture and the arts. His debut novel, Great Expectations, came out in 2024 and was a finalist for a National Book Critics Circle Award. The title of his talk is Flannery O'Connor's Signs of Contradiction, Thoughts on Fiction, the Individual, and the Times. We're very glad you're here, Vincent. Please help me welcome him.
Thank you all so much. I first need to admit the total impossibility of following the panel that came before this one about death in a way that was so paradoxically life-giving. And I want to just thank all of the presenters in that panel. It's still kind of rumbling around in my mind. The essay that I'm going to read for you today is a way perhaps of putting on one lane two of my constant concerns, one of which is Flannery O'Connor herself, and the other is as a novelist and also as an essayist and a critic, my obsession with individuals and society. And by society, I mean both places and times, the contingencies into which we seemingly eternal things find ourselves kind of tossed. And so mostly by reading two stories, I wanted to try to see how Flannery O'Connor bridges that divide, that crucible of person and context. There's something just right about the fact that Flannery O'Connor, known for her attention to a particular region and for her harrowingly total knowledge of its people, began her career by writing about a person out of place. A man sits in the small bedroom he shares with his grandson, looking out the window and waiting for the arrival on a ledge across a narrow alley of a geranium. The man is far from home. This is New York, where the man, old Dudley, has come to live with his daughter and her husband, who, according to Dudley, says nah for no, and has, quote, never heard of a possum, end quote. And the aforementioned grandson who, quote, was 16 and couldn't be talked to, end quote. Dudley's from the rural South, a place called Coa County, or simply home, where from his window in a boarding house peopled by old women who pay him daily compliments, he can see not the cramped opening to somebody else's private space, but a muddy river, slow moving and full of fish. Something about the pronounced but undecorated way in which O'Connor often notices and in turn describes color. The river's red, and that's that, red and slow. Makes me imagine phenomena seen as through a weak, pathetic light. O'Connor can make even the sun sound depressing. Someone like James Schuyler, one of the many hundreds of thousands of writers whom one could describe honestly as having a totally opposite sensibility to O'Connor's, can create a kind of charged elation through colorific detail. Take these lines from his great poem, February. One green wave moved in the violet sea like the UN building on big evenings, green and wet, while the sky turns violet. A few almond trees had a few flowers, like a few snowflakes out of the blue, looking pink in the light. Now, wherever in the city old Dudley is, whatever his larger view, I feel quite sure that he has never beheld the sea on an evening big or small, and found no tonal echoes between the water and the sky. The UN building, if ever he encountered it, he would consider a colorless slab, a glinting monstrosity, unfit for miscegenating Congress via simile with the stuff of the natural world. A red, slow river for him, please. No green, wet sea. Old Dudley, the comic star of the 1946 story The Geranium, hates New York. Yet there he sits, homesick at the window, waiting for the plant to appear on the opposite ledge, as it does, with the cold-hearted reliability of a worker at an unloved job every day between the hours of 10 and 5:30. Old Dudley wants to see this pop of color not to experience aesthetic pleasure, but to occasion yet another unfavorable comparison between this city, this non-place, and his home. Here's a paragraph from the story. Miss Carson back home had a geranium in her window. There were plenty of geraniums back home, better looking geraniums. Ours are show enough geraniums, old Dudley thought. Not any of this pale pink business with green paper bows. The geranium they would put in the window reminded him of the Grisby boy at home who had polio and had to be wheeled out every morning and left in the sun to blink. Lutetia could have taken that geranium and stuck it in the ground and had something worth looking at in a few weeks. Those people across the alley had no business with one. They set it out and let the hot sun bake it all day, and they put it so near the ledge the wind could almost knock it over. They had no business with it. No business with it. It shouldn't have been there. I have been thinking about Flannery O'Connor since I was a kid of 15 or 16, introduced to her by a favorite English teacher who, after I showed interest in a story, then another, bought me a copy of the complete stories. Studying her work has informed my interest in, and once in a while, maybe in my work, my management of symbol and tone, place and dialogue and theme. But if I had to choose a word that encapsulated my lasting attraction to O'Connor, it would be that sorrowful shouldn't. It shouldn't have been there. As if this plant of the space of the same species and substance as plants back home, but enjoying no similar care, could on its own, even without the intensity of old Dudley's judgments, feel the injustice of its situation. O'Connor to me is the supreme artist of should and shouldn't, a fine observer of the injury sustained by warring notions of duty, of ought, of the good. In her finest moments, which tend also to be her least comfortable moments, she paints a startling portrait of a troublesome type, the convinced individual in plural society. Many of O'Connor's people have a mulish, stubborn quality. They don't simply have motivations or desires, as so many writing manuals insist that all characters must have in order to convincingly inhabit dramatic situations. No, these people have a tougher fate than want or even need. All writers know this. Motivation wanes. Desire fades. A thing pined after at sunset is often forgotten by afternoon. O'Connor wrote characters who are not filled with longing, but painfully fit for a purpose. Prophets, preachers, philosophers, impossible old men. They are pointed towards some end whose deep meaning is, sure, somewhere just above their heads, but whose strictures, whose duties they cannot help but feel. When they are out of place, off rhythm, out of tune with their unchosen inner music, they feel the strain of disorder. Somehow they know where they should be, not New York. Not quivering out on that high ledge. In this context, bad-sounding words like provincialism and inflexibility, petty clinging to the crosshairs of place and time, become metaphors for something much more serious. I'm not an expert in the work of the recently deceased philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, but I have for many years been troubled by his stern critiques of liberal modernity. Liberal pluralism, in his view, is a lattice work of false freedoms, an outwardly pleasant distraction from the rigors of telos, of purpose, of final destination. Tried to write that line so it wouldn't remind me of that movie, but I failed to. We'll move on. This Aristotelian worldview of MacIntyre seems to me totally consonant with the ordeal faced by the O'Connorian character. The perfection and completion of a life, MacIntyre writes, on the final page of his final book, Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity, consists in an agent's having persisted in moving toward and beyond the best goods of which she or he knows. A guy like old Dudley, sentimental, bigoted, strangely vain, lacks the reason to achieve, much less move beyond the goods of which he thinks he knows. But this does nothing to salve the pressures of distance. Not only is this plant wrong, but the hallways in his daughter's huge and impersonal apartment building remind him of dog runs, an architectural feature better used for some purpose closer to the textures of his experience. The subways remind him of caves, of canals, and the multicolored people pouring out of them, quote, boil, unquote, and look, quote, all mixed up like vegetables in soup, end quote. Here, metaphor and simile work to create the impression of chaotic disjuncture. Things that look and act like what they are not are evidence to this kind of eye of a world that needs putting right. There's a Black man in Dudley's daughter's building who lives just next door, the horror, who doesn't seem to know what a Black man is for. Back home, he's got a Black flunky named Raby who fishes and hunts possum and steals chickens for old Dudley. They're a kind of two-man entertainment act. At least in Dudley's recollection, they're like an older and less spry iteration of Huck and Jim. This citified Black man in a sharp suit finds Dudley in the hallway one day. Dudley's been picking something up from a neighbor and on his way reminiscing about old Raby, even acting out the pointing of a gun. It's a slightly mystical moment, a marriage via memory of then and now, here and there, that is interrupted fatefully by this cool, unbothered cat. Ralph Ellison often wrote about how the figure he called the Negro was, in American literature, a symbol for man, capital M, more broadly. An example in extremis of the cruel vicissitudes, the existential troubles, the thousand natural shocks that flesh, all flesh, is heir to. I think that's sort of true in O'Connor's work, except that the kind of man called to mind by her Black figures, physically present or reminiscingly invoked, might be called Homo hierarchicus. The person who, by reminding us of earthly hierarchy, also reminds us of an unstinting hierarchy of goods, a strict vision in a lax world, a single-minded tool amid so many supposedly multi-purpose parts, telos surrounded by the appearance of options. That's the definition of a freak, one of O'Connor's favorite terms. That's a misfit. The more I practice the art of fiction, the more I am equally intrigued and repelled by this kind of dilemma, largely because one of the beauties of the novel, for me, or really of prose itself, always inviting everything in, is precisely its status as the pluralistic form par excellence. People amble about pursuing their own signs, making small decisions that add up to a life, or questing about with comic chestiness, all while the world flows by, slow and impassive as some river. Many of the American novels I like best toss their characters into close and dissonant proximity, chiming difficultly against one another like notes only a half step apart. Think of Saul Bellows' Chicago, or of Melville's Cosmopolitan Ship, staffed by an international crew, separated by so much water from the customs of any one stifling locality. Or think of Henry James's Europe, there often to remind Americans of freedoms not so readily apparent in, say, Boston. Even more, I didn't mean to say Boston so pejoratively. I apologize to anybody. Anybody of Boston experience. Even more simply, I love it when people take walks in fiction. It's the pure, childish, post-Flaubert pleasure of seeing a street or plaza or park described in a fleet series of images, which by some magic almost extrinsic to the page come together to form an implicit cinema. These Flanneurish fictional moments in which the book or the story takes a breath and the whole heaving society backgrounding the characters can take a second at the lip of the stage, these are evidence and a reminder of freedom. I've noticed that there aren't all that many free walks in O'Connor. Sometimes there's a forced march like the one taken by the characters in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, or a certain surveilled stroll that is the alluring mystery at the heart of the story, Good Country People. In that story, a sort of stuffy woman named Mrs. Hopewell, that is, excuse me, no disrespect, has taken on a family named Freeman as tenant workers. The matriarch of that family, Mrs. Freeman, has a reputation for nosiness and can never admit when she's wrong. She's also kind of a connoisseur of freaks. She has, quote, a special fondness for the details of secret infections, hidden deformities, assaults upon children, end quote. She also has a fetish for cataloging over breakfast the nocturnal vomiting spells of her pregnant 15-year-old daughter. Mrs. Freeman sounds a lot like a would-be Deanne Arbus, that cool-eyed genius photographer of outcasts and weirdos whose appearances and attitudes left them far outside the respectable mainstream. Mrs. Freeman is in luck because Mrs. Hopewell's daughter, Joy, is a true-to-God piece of work. She's a philosopher, first of all, which is scandal enough. She's left home to pursue, of all things, a PhD, the kind of thing about which her mother, a perfect weather vane for social normalcy, cannot brag. She lost much of her leg as a child and now walks with the help of a wooden leg. She suffers too from a heart ailment, one that makes it almost certain that she will die young. Joy had made it plain, the story says, that if it had not been for this condition, she would be far from these red hills and good country people. She would be in a university lecturing to people who knew what she was talking about, end quote. To her mother, quote, she was brilliant, but she didn't have a grain of sense, end quote. In other words, she was a nice tool for a foreign project, a bundle of ends at odds to the work at hand. Elsewhere, the story says that it seemed to Mrs. Hopewell that every year she, Joy, grew less like other people and more like herself, bloated, rude, and squint-eyed. Less like home, that is, more otherworldly, which is to say, estranged. The ultimate sign of Joy's estrangement is, of course, her decision to take the name Hulga, which for me is one of the most sublime and silly jokes in O'Connor's oeuvre. What a stupid thing, Hulga. Few things about names, though. First, they are the first imposition that your parent, and therefore the civilization into which you are born, is licensed to make upon you. The first of many. The one that teaches you that many of the details that will define you precede you and are largely beyond your own control. My mother used to point out to me that my so-called freedom was actually bracketed by the rules of her house, which implicitly echoed the laws of God. As for me and my house, she would say, we will serve the Lord. I like the longer version of that quotation from the book of Joshua. Joshua is imploring the Israelites to make a definite choice about the object of their worship, simultaneously acknowledging a plurality of devotional options, but asserting the correctness of his own. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, he says, choose you this day whom ye will serve. Another thing my mom used to quote came from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. What, know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which ye have of God? And ye are not your own, for ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. Paul's reiterating for his readers in Corinth the household rules laid down by Joshua. In the household of the Lord, your body, your identity, your name is not your property. Your purpose was a thing decided long before the day of your birth. I'm reminded of the mother in Lorraine Hansberry's play A Raisin in the Sun, who finds occasion at a hot moment in the action to slap her college-age daughter and make her repeat this statement: "In my mother's house, there is still God." Mrs. Hopewell takes no such action with Joy/Hulga, who has chosen her own name, if not totally wrenched herself away from the household of her mother. At one point, Hulga, having had enough of her self-righteous mother, explodes, "Woman, do you ever look inside? Do you ever look inside and see what you are not? God." Now, the God there is an ambivalent utterance. Hulga probably means to be peppering her speech with a final exasperated syllable, taking the Lord's name in vain to boot. But combing the page with your eyes, it's hard not to see that she has, possibly accidentally, informed her mother of her own non-deity. Hulga is not a believer, but she knows not God when she sees her. It's a way to say, yes, I was bought with a price, but not yours. I was given a name, but not joy. By choosing philosophy as a field of endeavor, and however churlishly taking the pursuit seriously, she has put herself in the way of ultimate ends, and therefore back in the way of the local trouble, the local duty from which she wants so badly and so fruitlessly to escape. In Mrs. Hopewell, Mrs. Freeman, and Joy Hulga, hope, freedom, and joy, these sounds like fruits of the spirit. O'Connor seems to me to have drawn a triangle of social and teleological approbation, and at the same time, a complex, fluid, tripartite portrait of herself as a writer and as a personality. She's at once the prim upholder of and abider by the subtle rules of social order, the secret lover of the lurid and of the freakish. And she's also the highly learned freak, all writers are freaks, herself. Soon a young Bible salesman drops by, and unaccountably, after ignoring him over a meal, Hulga walks with him straight out of the door, out to the fence that borders the family's realm. Of course, Mrs. Freeman sees. Nothing good comes of it. Certainly no freedom. Earlier, I spoke about my attraction to O'Connor's work and also some measure of repulsion, but neither of these words really grasp my true sentiment. I feel tossed into ambivalence by O'Connor. Many people whom I admire, I noticed it today already so much, people feel a special closeness to her. They call her Flannery when making reference to her work, or the words of her journals and letters. In a wonderful recent play, Heroes of the Fourth Turning by Will Arbery, a young conservative woman disabled and besotted with O'Connor's prayer journals refers to her as, quote, "my gal Flannery O," end quote. But despite my attachment to the work, to borrow a phrase from Emily Dickinson, a formal feeling comes whenever I have O'Connor in mind. Perhaps this is because the harsh chiaroscuro of her fiction drives a stake, or perhaps more precisely, a cross between what appear to me to be two intertwined goods: pluralistic getting along and Aristotelian hankering after the good, or to use the title of MacIntyre's famous book, After Virtue. We, all of us, it seems to me, are today presented with a series of dilemmas that seem directly salient to this crux of O'Connor's. Technologies rocket ahead of any earthly government's resolve to regulate them, often operating with the express purpose of making us feel fit for less work. called to a lower purpose than human culture once boldly asserted for our species. New political formations explicitly drawing upon and often exaggerating the worst aspects of last century's low points, valorize stupidity and narrow meanness, weaponize our tribal suspicions, all the while fattening up our all too willing brains for a slaughter yet to come. Last night, I stayed up too late, partially to witness the United States president's public food fight with a rocket-making Nazi. Times are hard.
Me too.
Every day, more images of war visited upon children using money that has something to do with me. I do so much like life in its unorganized mundanity. My actions aimed at little else but the comforts and enjoyments of my friends. But I wonder today if it's time to be a freak. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was amazing. One of my favorite things about the name Holga is it's what she says she chooses it, right? Because it's the ugliest name she can think of. But it's one letter away from Helga, which is from the Old Norse, which means holy.
There you go.
So, chiaroscuro at work. We've got some time for questions. Plenty of time for questions.
Hi, thank you so much for
Thank you.
it's such an interesting time. I can be interested in your planners, make more things. Focus their color. I mean, one of my finished novels have been released, finished by a scholar. I was just curious, as a novelist, kind of how you see that work and how you would, I don't know, think about that when you come in.
The sort of the practice of releasing the unfinished novel kind of thing. I feel very torn about it, partially because some writers, including it seems to me O'Connor herself, who's prepared her letters in such a way, for instance, that it seems that she perhaps had future publication in mind. But a novel is such a soup to nuts thing. And it seems to me always a big gamble to publish something that someone wasn't ready to publish. But at the same time, I read with pleasure many times, for example, the slice of Ralph Ellison's never finished second novel that's now called Juneteenth, and has some passages that I love. And I guess I'm a little bit of a hypocrite because when people that I care about, this happens, I do kind of run to it to see at least what they were thinking. But I do think that it has to be thought of as that, what they were thinking, instead of as a finished artifact, mostly because this is why no generative AI will ever actually write a novel, because its only skill is organizational, and organization is far from the final consideration when it comes to fiction. You can outline all you want, but the action happens actually while writing, because writing is like a technology that helps you arrive at new thoughts, not a mode of execution to thoughts that you've already had, right? So I say all that to say that I feel really torn about it. I don't know. Yeah.
Can you say your last sentence again?
I do tend to black out when I speak, but I think I said, that writing is it's a technology, I think, that that helps us arrive at new thoughts. This is the reason why I have the fake thing called writer's block ever, is that I think that I'm supposed to start writing when I know what to write. And this is like the actual inverse of the truth, which is that writing, that, word by word, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, is a mode of discovery, and a way of clarifying thought. I never think well away from the page. That's why I do this, and so I'm always galled when people, show me their great plans to complete real writing. It just seems to me backward, but that's only me. And no shaming, not an outline shamer. I'm just saying.
I think Jess had a question.
Oh, I was just gonna say Flannery says, as well, I write because I don't know what I think until I read what I say, so I'm not totally alone in it.
It's very true, very true.
So I've always wanted to ask this question as someone who works at the New Yorker. So O'Connor was down on Eudora Welty's story, "Where's the Voice Coming From?"
Mm.
Published in the New York.
Mm-hmm.
It called it topical, and she talks about the topical being, poisonous and all this sort of thing, and yet says that she gets away with the topical and everything that rises must converge.
Mm-hmm.
But she says something like, as far as the race question goes, I say, pox on both of their houses or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The New Yorker is such an interesting space and has been for a long time.
Yeah.
You get to do the kind of thing that you just did at the end of your talk, which is slide over, at least the way I heard it.
And
You
like
watched
do a
it.
little sermon, you mean?
Yeah, which I love,
Yeah,
Connor was, of course, famously irritated by that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But which the liberal Yankees smacking their lips, she says something like that.
Yeah.
About Eudora Welty's story. So can you weigh in for the record?
Sure. Let me just
You speak for
step into a corner with my friends O'Connor and Welty, and no, I think that it is the special province of the periodical, like the magazine, as opposed to like the places where O'Connor, literary journals where O'Connor really plied her trade most famously, right? The province of the magazine is precisely to be not evergreen, and it's very humbling when you have worked painstakingly on a piece that, of 3,000 words or 10,000 words, right? And the only places you ever see it are some lawyer on an airplane or in a pile in your friend's bedroom, flagrantly unread. Do you know what I mean? That or the famous saying that, like, today's news is tomorrow's fish wrapping, all that kind of stuff. The perishability of journalism and of something like the essay in a journalistic context is something that I really enjoy, mostly because I grew up listening mostly to sermons, which are, the scripture in one hand and the news and today's headlines in the other. Something about that direct address, that sort of ability to insert oneself into the topics of the day, topicality. Some call hokey, and I get it, but I quite like. But I thought about that. So as I was finishing this up, I was like, okay, so like, as I do, because I'm also vain, every time I finish a piece like this, I'm like, well, if I were to try to put this in an essay collection, for example, I might do a different ending. This is for people who are with me today. And I think what's good about writing is that, the hope always is that it can do both of those things at once. Sort of make interjections in the moment, but also speak in a different dimension. So, yeah.
Speaking of topicality, O'Connor, as we know, was influenced by, many great writers of the Western canon, and as are you, as we've seen magnificently displayed. Among her holdings in her own library were the works of Charles Dickens, presumably Great Expectations. So I'm wondering if you see an influence of Dickens in O'Connor's work, and what might be the influence of Dickens on you in your own work called Great Expectations?
Well, kind of what I said about, thank you for that. It's such a good question. What I was saying about her way of sort of demystifying or romanticizing, usually kind of, I don't know, iconic images like the sun, for example, is like, one way of saying it is that O'Connor's whole world is like Miss Havisham's house. or something like that. Just dust on the sills or whatever, you know. But I think that they have a very different, maybe not approach to, but camera angle on society. Whereas, you know, Dickens thinks it's to be found, yes, in drawing rooms and bedrooms, but also on factory floors and other things like this. O'Connor seems to me so interested in the places where, and these have to be close-ups, right? The places where, another way to get at what I was trying to get at here is where not just manners, but the truly like the high stakes of everyday interaction take place. As for me, I wrote my book before it had that name. And I shuffled through many different titles. And then I was at a party with my friend Emily Nussbaum, the great critic, and we were joking, and she was like, wouldn't it be great if a book like this could be called Great Expectations? And we all laughed and laughed and laughed. And the next day I called my editor and I was like, please let me do it. Please let me do it. I just thought that given my novel is set in around the time of the first, what would have been the first Obama campaign, and it's the campaign of an unnamed senator who bears striking resemblance to Obama, and the high hopes, as it was called, the hope and change of that time. I just thought that Great Expectations was I thought it was a really high-toned joke, which, you know, some people took and some people did not, but really the parallel between that book and my book is a narrator who is young and gets swept up by a benefactor into a world he had previously not known of or seen. So, but I could never be as assonant as Charles Dickens. Every holiday season, I do this thing called "What's the Dickens," and we go to Housing Works in New York and read A Christmas Carol, and the just unhidden iambic pentameter that he uses in his sentences, and the vowel play, the juiciness of those sentences is amazing. I can't do it.
Just so you know, we're not far from the Charles Dickens house.
I heard.
And it's well worth visiting.
Yeah. One of these evenings,
I think a photo op with you holding your book in front of you.
Yeah.
There we go. There we go.
That's what we need.
There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm probably going to externally process a bit. So maybe just the very simplest question first is how you'd speak broadly about this relationship in O'Connor's work between the freak, quote unquote, as a lens for thinking about telos and norms and the normative and teleology more broadly. I mean, two images I have in my mind right now. One that I think it's a fairly kind of ironic time to be pluralistic because there's so many hyper-normative ways in which news media like conforms us to a certain kind of consumerist model or visions of beauty, et cetera, right? And in that sense, maybe there's something about the kind of prophetic, space, exceptional, aberrant, sitting outside of, right, the norm that can be socially critical, that can maybe open up something that is a more kind of, I don't know, virtue ethics oriented notions of normative goods in a good sense. And on the other hand, I'm thinking about the geranium you mentioned, and I'm a total non-expert, so please fill in details in ways that could help.
You and me both, brother.
That it shouldn't have been here. Are you reading that as like, no, the geranium is meant to be out in the field, it's meant to be in a full context, or is there something paradoxically kind of flourishing there, right? It shouldn't have been there, but it was there.
Mm-hmm.
Because in that sense, I guess it taps into all of the language we heard from Mayor Grace earlier about being placed and context and being, thrownness of reality as something which limits the self potentially. But is there something, I guess I'm trying to wonder about like telos and grace or a kind of paradoxical fittingness of that constraint in her work?
Yeah, I think it contains, I think the first part of that the second part of that first. I think my reading is that it contains hints of both readings that you offered. Yes, by some strange miracle, this geranium can exist in two radically different climes and under two very different regimes of care, I guess. But at the same time, there is something for him perverted. It's not a good state. It's a perverted about the presence of the geranium. And of course, at the end of the story, the geranium ends up at the bottom, in the alley itself. It has finally fallen off the ledge and its roots are sticking upward. It is finally uprooted as if to admit finally its unfitness for this place. In the same way as for old Dudley, a black man is perverse not only in a suit but in an apartment adjoining the one in which his daughter lives, right? So a miracle, yes, the presence, but only a kind of perverse miracle. As to what you said, could you synopsize what you said first? Because I now having thought about that, the other one dropped out of my head. I know it had to do with virtue ethics and.
Yeah, I guess how Flannery O'Connor is using kind of the space of the aberrant as a way to think about human flourishing. Is it, actual real social critique, or is it all just stripping away, well, that's just racism, that's just not embracing, because you could shoot it in highly pluralistic directions, or as you're saying, no, there's real claims about what's self-destructive and what's.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that there are many forms of freak in the way that I'm thinking about it, but all of them are premised on the idea of the human as a teleological being. So you can, the old adage, everybody's got to worship something. You can be hooked on, directed toward perhaps a faulty end, and this will make you not flourish really in any situation, right? Therefore, making you a freak even in the situation that is oriented toward the good. Perhaps this is old Dudley's dilemma, but perhaps also the person who is oriented toward, and I think this is perhaps the dilemma that McIntyre sets forward, and that I think you sometimes see, but only in the smallest moments in O'Connor, where someone is finally actually oriented toward the good, and their coexistence with so many other competing faulty goods makes them a freak against that backdrop, right? And so either way, it is the sort of ingredients are telos and context, creating a contrast, a stress, a strain, and a literal misfit that I think is what I'm trying to talk about, maybe. Yeah. Because like virtue ethics, for example, works even when the virtue is false. If you orient yourself towards something and exercise the goods, that you can become an excellent murderer, an excellent pervert through the same process by which another person might become a saint, right? And so, yeah, anyway.
I'm thinking about, so interesting to hear you talk about the geranium. First of all, fantastic talk. Thank you so much. It's provoking so many thoughts in my mind. But one of them is what happens between the original writing of the story and then the sort of 4 times that she rewrites it. And then at the end, with Judgment Day, the geranium is gone.
Yeah.
So I was just curious if you have any thoughts about that.
I was thinking about that during the writing of this talk, and I kind of kept going to the other versions, and I'm not sure. I think I might be the only one who likes the geranium better than all the other versions. I think it does everything. It has an economy that the others don't have, and the dual symbol structure of the plant and this black man, this like dual symbology of misplacement, again a person who thinks he's, one of the funniest things in the story in the Geranium is old Dudley says that like if he were to go back home, he would say to his friend Raby, his Jim character, "Oh, New York ain't so big. It's nothing to worry about." That this false bravado, part of what for him it means to be well adjusted is to seem totally comfortable in every environment. When in fact all he does is sit in his room and literally cry. I think it's so beautifully pathetic. And I think it seems like the story takes on more armor every time she rewrites. It just more and more context and more complexity. Whereas I kind of think the first try was just the one. It's the one for me.
Oh, interesting. One of the things that you said just reminded me of the ending when you were talking about reminding us of the geranium at the end is not only the pot is broken, but the roots are sticking up.
Mhm.
And I was reminded of the last image that we see of Dudley or of T.C. Tanner.
Mhm.
It's like he's shoved between the railings of the banister and, dead. And there's almost this sense of like the geranium has been transformed into heat.
Into him, yeah. I mean, to me, she is the artist of just the developing symbol. I mean, I learned when that teacher gave me that the complete stories way back. She also told me about O'Connor's love of the book Christ and Apollo, which is, of course, about the sort of ancient techniques, the many levels of reading a text. And it seems to me that like her work with symbols, the way like she can turn the plant into the man over the course of decades is the best example I know of how writing is actually an inversion of reading, where if you learn the many ways to read a text, you can sort of flip that around and ease your way into the writing that might satisfy this and this and this mode of hermeneutic approach. So that to me is the thing that I still want to learn from O'Connor more than maybe anything else.
I love that. That was great. And, you mentioned Ellison. Ellison had this idea of the novel as a function of American democracy, right? Like the novel is the form in which you can take all of the seeming ephemera, the news, the politics, the social mores, changing psychology, and freeze time and slow time and explore the kind of combat of our manners, morals, religious sentiments as, we sort of move together collectively as a society. And I was fascinated by your sort of juxtaposition between kind of pluralism and then this sort of rigidity and discomfort in a world of telos and ends. And I wondered if you could talk, O'Connor's a short story writer.
Yeah.
And even the novels, like Wise Blood is like, there's a central, powerful driving.
Yeah.
It's not.
That sprawling thing.
Yeah. It's not a novel of society, right?
Yeah.
It's a long, short story. And I wondered if you could just talk about if there's a formal issue at hand in terms of what the different forms can do, what makes you good for exploring democracy, versus what the short story is good for, versus what the sort of the median art that we mostly consume today is, in terms of American democracy.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Yesterday was the first time Phil and I actually met, but we've like talked on podcasts before. And I feel like maybe all of the times that we've talked, we have ended up talking about Ellison, like a sort of mutual interest of ours. And I love that. And I think what you're like referencing is Ellison gives this speech upon receiving the National Book Award. And in this speech, it's his first novel. He wins the National Book Award for it. He's like, and Nelson's not a humble guy. So it's like, and he goes like, so obviously if I'm winning this thing, it must mean that something's wrong with American fiction, right? And like, I fixed it, right? So let me tell you, and his diagnosis is is basically that like since the great writers of the 19th century, he mentions Twain specifically, there has been this narrowing and this flight from the great purpose of the novel to manage democracy, its existential stakes, hence, and also the sort of huge multivalent, and I think this goes to O'Connor very directly, huge multivalent polyphony of American speech, where someone like Ellison and also his close friend for a time, Saul Bellow, they shared a house in Tivoli, New York. All I want is like to like live in the basement of this house. Bellow's like wearing ripped jeans and blasting Bach and working. It's like, I love it. But in both of those, the sort of the talkiness, the management of folk speech and high academic speech and Shakespearean diction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, trying to give a talk that is like what Ellison's friend Albert Murray would have called omni-American, whereas O'Connor's like brilliance with language. Dialogue is another thing that I'm always trying to learn with her, is about the pitch perfect hearing of a certain series of notes, as opposed to the symphonic. I think that like approach to language is maybe a metaphor for their views of what society can do in a novel. So like, if you look at those are novels, but if you look at the 19th century, you wouldn't pick Melville as her match, but you would pick Hawthorne, who similarly is obsessed with a certain people and a certain place. I love that story, Young Goodman Brown is this, this guy, he's the young, enthusiastic Puritan, and he goes into the woods one night and he learns that everybody he knows is the devil. Is it a dream? Is it not? I don't know. But like, or the House of the Seven Gables, where it's like, this one family drives out a less fortunate family from the area where they have a general store, accusing them of witchcraft, but so they build this big family house at the site of this triumph, and the first time they're supposed to have a party, this dude's dead, and then the house becomes a curse forevermore. It is very, I mean, this and you hear the tones. If you want to learn how, the Massachusetts resident of Hawthorne's time sounded, what his deep concerns are, his like attitudes toward the woods, which are of course haunted with, whatever, blood. Anne Bradstreet is crying out with a burning house from like some echo on the wind. That's what you go to the specific for Hawthorne. Whereas, the cosmopolitan, the huge, the urbane, the meeting of two ships, as Melville has it in his story, Benito Sereno, those meetings are rare in Hawthorne, as it is also in O'Connor. So it's like, I think it's a matter of interest. And again, maybe of like camera angle.
And might it also be, you just reminded me of the fact that O'Connor, as she said, I have the original tin ear. I don't like music. I don't know what to listen for. And she also didn't care very much for poetry. And so she doesn't have that symphonic, that ability really, but she has a great ear for the sounds of people's voices, and for dialogue. And so I wonder how much of this has to do with an artist's own disposition in terms of how they hear things.
Well, Ellison was, before he was a writer, a trumpeter. He was, grew up in Oklahoma, and that was his thing. He says that he didn't admit to himself until he started writing Invisible Man that he was even a writer. He was writing all these reviews and still thinking that this was like a way of becoming a Renaissance man on the side, as while he's working on his jazz career, and and as I said, Bellow just like always wrote with like classical music blasting. I don't know if he could do any music, but like, yeah.
We do have a couple minutes. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So do I understand you correctly that, you're saying that, like, the ability to achieve your telos is dependent upon being where you're supposed to be, and that's where, that's what's going on with the geranium, and related, like, how do you think that reflects maybe O'Connor's city, because you talked about all the competing goods, and it seems like there's more of that. I was wondering if I guess I'm asking, am I understanding you
Yeah.
correctly?
Well, I didn't say that, partially because like I don't want to do amateur theology because it will be bad. But it does seem to me that this also is like, to me, is like one of the, I don't think that O'Connor and Walker Percy are that similar, but in this way they might be similar, in which the way that place might intersect with this is that place too, even home, can be an idol, and that you can attach yourself teleologically to one place and think that by, fealty to kith and kin, you are orienting yourself toward the good, and even that is a dead end, perhaps sometimes. And that seems to be maybe old Dudley's problem too, that his God is that red, slow river. It is almost kind of pagan the way he describes it, Um, as to that question, I think the direct answer to that though would have to be no. That that place is a contingency, a context, a backdrop against which you might work out your salvation, whatever, but I don't know. It seems to me that like the goods, that all the goods that I can think of, the true goods that I can think of, are universal goods. This is why you can like duck into any confession, like you walk through the streets of Manhattan and you pass 17 confessionals before you reach the corner, that like everywhere there are these portals of grace, that this is a universal thing, not a that anything that tries to bracket you in one place is kind of a dead end. This is why I like Jesuits who are like, yep, my superior said I gotta go to China, sorry, boop. And it's like it's about non-attachment to place. It's about non-attachment to particulars, even though particulars are good. This is the genius, I think, of Pope Francis's Fratelli Tutti, where he talks about the particular is good. I'm from Buenos Aires. I love soccer. I love the food. It's good for everybody to be attached to a place, but in a way that makes it more, that draws us closer and closer and closer and closer to the particulars of others, such that we can be universal and particular all at the same time. And if we get, if we get stuck on ourselves as individuals, dead end. If we get stuck on sort of the context from which we come, dead end. But it's in like a sort of flexible interplay of these things that we can achieve our ultimate ends. I don't know. That's me. I don't know if Flannery kind of thinks that. That's me.
We have 30 seconds, so yeah, fast question. Yes, in the back.
Probably a terrible question to ask with a few seconds left, but I just thought maybe you could speak something to it. So you open with a character, not knowing what to do with a Black man, and then you talked about personally, like relating to people here. It's like relating to O'Connor and your experience as a college student. So when I read things I have about O'Connor, personally upset and trying to reconcile, O'Connor and race, like someone who, exposes racism in her stories and then contributes to it in real life. And I guess when I was trying to reconcile that, I read, and it might have even been someone here who said it, that where we should start is with what Black people have to say about O'Connor, about that topic. And so I wanted to ask you if, with your experience, experiencing her early and then like maybe more things being revealed that were in her journal and things that were letters, have you had a personal struggle? Like, were you personally hurt as a Black man to read things or?
Yeah.
And to add to that, just the conversation, like I was speaking about Zadie Smith and someone over here brought up Charles Dickens and she was asked a similar question. She was never fraud, dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had some thoughts on like, okay, over here, I think he's a great writer and over here, I think he was wrong. So if you just had a few seconds to
Sure.
that, do you have something to share with us?
No, yeah, this is part of the, the end of the thing where I talk about the sort of formal feeling I feel with O'Connor. I never, there are people that this might apply to, but she is not someone who I had attached any sort of love for the work, yes, like sort of personal affinity, no, we couldn't have been more different to begin with. And so, no, certainly not a personal hurt. But this, if I were to sort of adopt a sort of this way of thinking about things, I just wouldn't have anything to read, Like Saul Bellow famously asked, who was the Tolstoy of the Zulus, right? It was an incredibly racist thing. And I love those novels and I'm still trying to learn from them. And, it's a strange business, but if you just read the stories, it's like being at a Klan rally. I tried, you know how many N-words I took out of this thing? It's like, just like, words and things, but I think that I came of age I'm an older millennial, I guess. My high school happened in the late 90s or whatever. It was what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. And I kind of thought racism might be over. So I think that I was weirdly educated at a time when everybody had, falsely or not, a lot of tough skin around this stuff. We read those stories out loud with the words in, and it was not an all-Black school. And the teacher wasn't always Black and they were saying it. And we were all like, this is us being adults. So I do think that sometimes I wish I had a softer heart about these things, but I feel like I will admit that it's part of my self-conception that that's not gonna bother me. She's just a writer and she's dead anyway, RIP, but this way we all must go. But I didn't experience it like that, but I do think it's a great and productive conversation to have.
Actually, those words, Zadie Smith responded with the words, "Well, he's dead," when she was first done. She added some more action.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to end. The conversations will continue over lunch. Vinson Cunningham, thank you.